Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll serve as your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about preparing for another important proxy and disclosure season. And joining me, as he does annually, is Ron Schneider, who's the Director of Corporate Governance Services for DFIN Solutions. Welcome back, Ron.
Thank you, TK. Pleasure to be with you.
So it seems like every year I'm saying this is going to be the busiest year with disclosures. And I think I can safely say that again, that when you look at it seems like all the outside factors that are influencing proxies. But that's why we have you on, to sort of understand what's going on. So can you review all the factors that are driving the need for companies to provide disclosures and equally to be creative in their proxies?
Certainly, TK. And as you know, and as many of your viewers know, I mean, there is the relatively minimal SEC 14A compliance requirements, but most mature public company proxies and many younger companies are on a voluntary basis adding additional contextual information in their proxies. And, there's been intense interest by a range of investors and others for years on issues like board diversity measured in a variety of ways and executive compensation and how is that aligned with and supportive of the business strategy. But this year, and I really don't think either you or I are exaggerating, where you have some issues colliding that you are addressed in proxies, maybe not exclusively so, but and also are very interrelated. So three big issues as we, here we are in hopefully the end stages of year two and the end stages of the COVID impact, but renewed ESG focus by investors. Okay, so when COVID first hit, many companies were literally in survival mode, and many investors provided a fair amount of forbearance in terms of their companies progressing on the sustainability journey and on their reporting of their progress on that journey. But if anything, COVID and the factors behind it and its impacts just galvanized investor focus that they're on the right track. And sustainability can be measured many ways, but they want their portfolio companies to be sustainable and have legs themselves and to survive the current environment. And so that focus is extremely tight, and companies are reporting on it at their websites and in reports and the likes. But most are also including some form of highlights of ESG and the companion topic of human capital management. And for many companies, they're largely owned by, some large index investors, the BlackRocks, Vanguard, State Street Globals, and others. And they're going to raise sustainability and related issues on their engagement calls. They're going to own you no matter what, but they're going to engage with you on those issues. When it comes to the actively managed investors, it's important to note that approximately 1 out of $3 actively managed in the U.S. has some form of ESG screening component to it in the investment selection process. So, it really does matter. So there's a renewed ESG focus and the related reporting thereon, disclosure of COVID impact. And, for some companies, it may have significantly impacted their performance, their business model, their workforce, their customers, their supply chains, and put related pressure on board oversight of those issues. Some may have made some compensation moves in response to COVID impact, and those are going to need careful attention when they may be very well justified, but investors are going to look at those carefully, when looking at next year's say on pay. And then the third, the new regulatory human capital disclosure requirements. And these became effective last summer, really in the 10K, requiring companies take a principles-based approach to how material human capital issues are to their company and to, provide some reporting initially in the 10K, but we are seeing many companies and continue that story in the proxy as well. So, and there's a lot of interplay between those topics. The focus on ESG, COVID impact. For many companies, their COVID story was their human capital story and how it affected their employees and some of the health and safety and remote work and related moves that they made. And that certainly ties into the human capital disclosures. And the other thing we're seeing that's challenging some companies or that they are focusing on is, they report on these issues in various documents, different locations. Most of them find their way to their website. And yet many of them, drafted by different teams. They look very different. And, the branding could be one thing, but, it does get to be a concern with investors if they don't see consistent messaging. So I think that's another, there's more and more disclosure, but you got to be careful that your story is consistent and that it's supported by your actions. And then a new matter for NASDAQ companies, tying back to the board diversity, their newly approved rule by the SEC, effective for most companies in 2022, that they have at least 2 diverse directors, one self-identifying as female and one self-identifying as an underrepresented minority and or LGBTQ plus status. And that reporting initially would be at their website. It, like many other things, it's going to find the way into the proxy as well. So, and that on top of all the concerns about strategy and performance. I think the biggest theme, though, that was getting greater and greater last year and the year before is board oversight. Investors really want to see how the board provides effective oversight of this growing range of important issues.
So we'll talk about your annual guide in a minute, but first of all, I want to touch on the subject. You and I every year talk about how companies can not only report, some of these issues, but actually tell a story and make it so that somebody can understand exactly how they're tackling some of these issues versus just having sort of legalese, to say that I've done it. So talk a little bit about what you see on how people get fairly creative in their efforts to, quote, tell the story.
Okay, well, it's like anything else, TK. You want to know your audience, and there are multiple audiences for these disclosures, certainly. But investors of all types, particularly major long-term institutional investors that dominate the ownership at many companies, know what their hot button issues are. Some directors participate directly in engagement with these investors, and they learn firsthand, and that's invaluable. Others may make the effort, and the investors say, "Well, we don't need to talk." That's kind of good news. They don't have a major problem with your company, but it's not very illuminating. That said, investors like BlackRock and others are extremely transparent. There's, whether it's Larry Fink's annual letter to CEOs and a lot of the reporting that they put at their website and the events that they speak at, good opportunity to know what they're looking for. Also, good to look at your peer company proxies. I mean, everyone has a sense where the governance leader companies are and some of the creativity going on there. And yet most of our clients don't want to be in the cutting edge of disclosure, but they don't want to be perceived as laggards relative to their peers by investors or others. So keep an eye on what your peer companies are doing and saying and how they're doing it. They may be elevating their game year over year, so it's not set it and forget it. So periodically check in on them. And then, introspectively think about, okay, well, how do our practices, number one, and B, our disclosure of those practices stand up relative to these peers? Because many of the ESG and other ratings and rankings are done on a relative basis. So, it's one thing to have good practices. If the world doesn't know about them, you don't get credit. So that's why I say, how do your practices stand up and how do your disclosures of those practices stand up? And then, once you have that, I think that a central theme, there should be one business strategy, right? And so, whether you're talking about the board skills and the mix of skills and competencies, how do they support the current and foreseeable future strategic needs of the company? I mentioned the appropriateness of executive compensation to the business strategy. Is it supportive of that strategy and aligned with it? And then when you come to a discussion of ESG risks and opportunities, certainly that's a strategic topic. So I think that that's one way to make sure that you're telling a unified story, is think how each of those elements ties to the business strategy, which you've already articulated through investor relations and other channels. And investors are looking for consistency between, IR and governance and proxy and ESG disclosures, which they don't always find everywhere. And then depending on the company, infusing their branding. We've seen companies use elements of their branding in graphs, or highlighting, it's such a human capital focus. So many companies are highlighting their people, not just the board and executive leadership, but different elements of their workforce, visually in areas throughout the proxy. Tying in that branding. And so many of our conversations are certainly with legal and, a lot of the drafters, but they're also with, marketing and risk and finance and others trying to, use that consistent, company brand message, throughout the document. So I would say, listen to your investors, look at your peers, and you'll make some good choices.
Great point and a great segue. We have just a couple minutes left, Ron, but I really want to talk about your annual guide. I believe this is the 9th year that you've produced it, and it's a guide to effective proxies that every year I tell people to take a shortcut, rather than having to do a bunch of work on finding out the creative ways that you can tell your story. This guide, I think you guys do a great job of sort of collecting all that information and showing, whether it's charts or ways that different companies have handled, disclosures and telling a story in the proxy. So, is there anything special in this year's guide that will be, certainly helpful to companies in addition to what you guys do on an annual basis?
Yes. So more of the same and some new features. So I'll very quickly. So we're privileged to work with a significant percentage of corporate America on their proxies and other disclosure documents. And many of these companies are extremely thoughtful and creative. And so with their permission, we annually, and this is the 9th edition coming up, compile nothing you wouldn't find at sec.gov, but we kind of slice and dice it by proxy section, topic, or feature, about 30 different sections, rather than, by company where you have to hunt through to see what do they talk about, how do they talk about, where do they talk about it, and the like. So we've known companies have looked to peers and others at the SEC site. So we just thought we'd make it a little more searchable and functional that way. Some of the sections with the greatest evolution and received the most attention over the last couple of years have been the substantive CEO and board cover letters, management and the board putting their stamp on issues and through photos and others helping to humanize executive and board leadership, board diversity, including skills, qualifications, a range of types of skills matrices, increasingly highlighting ESG, human capital, and similar competencies that may be resident on the board. As I mentioned before, board oversight of risk generally, as well as ESG. Some companies talk about them separately. Others combine them into one discussion. And increasingly, these board processes are described visually, not just in dense text. Director recruitment and refreshment, how does that process work? What have been the outcomes from following that process on recent refreshment? And then, of course, a section on ESG highlights. How are companies describing, not their full ESG program, that's reserved for the website, but, some of the highlights. And there we work with companies to take an approach that identifies some of the most material elements that might move the needle on the raters and rankers. Sometimes we hear from clients that we put our new ESG report at our website and none of the ratings seem to move. And then they put some well-aimed highlights in the next proxy, which is a regulatory document. And that does get scrutinized carefully by raters, rankers, and others. And then they tend to pick up some of those new and give you credit for some of those new things. So it's kind of a second bite at the apple on the raters and rankers. And then within ESG, human capital and its subsidiary topics about diversity, equity, and inclusion, employee health and safety, workforce development and engagement. Many more companies have much more rigorous programs there. They're describing them at greater depth. They're getting more scrutiny. And the one brand new section that didn't exist before, we've always had board diversity graphics. We now have a section on workforce diversity graphics, which, again, that story started in the 10K and in investor relations. But as long as companies are talking about board and DE&I, they might as well talk about workforce diversity in the proxy as well. So, all the old board-related and compensation-related sections are there with updated examples from what companies did last year. But that's where we've seen the greatest amount of movement and creativity over the last year or two.
Well, every year I say the same thing. This serves as a tremendous shortcut, and all the corporate secretaries and the GCs and the board people I talk to that are involved in the proxy always speak very highly. So I certainly would recommend it. I actually haven't had a chance to see this year's, Ron, but where can I and others get a copy of the guide?
Okay, it is available online at no cost to anybody. The site is www.proxydocs, proxydocs.com/X DFIN, our name, Donnelly Financial X.
Well, Ron, it's always a pleasure. And thank you for updating our audience on what's going to be, again, another unique proxy season. And again, we recommend the guide as a shortcut. So thanks for joining us.
TK, thank you very much.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.